So tonight I'm going to be going over lighting. Use the scene file provided, and there is a scene file that Paul had provided which uses simple geometry, but I also provided a room that I had modeled a couple years back. So if you're feeling so bold, if you feel like you have a really good grasp on lighting, you can either take the simplified room version or you can take the more complex room version. And from there, you can position the camera in, say, the more complex room and find the composition that you like and use today's, use the stuff that I'm going over today to be able to light that portion of the room. So use the scene file provided, light the living room scene 2 different ways, pick from the following: early morning, midday, early evening, late at night. Read through the provided PDF for more details on Maya lights, options such as light fog, which may be useful. Oh, I gotta update Mozilla now.
No, you don't.
It says unable to update. Okay.
So you can't.
Thanks for letting me know that
So
it
people
came.
saw ways, she's gonna.
Okay. Read through the provided PDF for more details, which may be useful when you're lighting your scene. Upload a rendered frame from each of your 2 lighting scenarios. I would suggest creating 2 scene files, 2 MA files that have the 2 lighting scenarios in them. Name your files using the following format. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions as you're working on your project. Everyone should have my email address. So there is this light scene, which is Paul's scene. This Room 02 is the scene that I modeled a couple years back. This lighting PDF is pretty, it's slightly older, but it is relatively comprehensive. It goes over some good names. If you're searching for a specific name on the light, it's a good thing to gloss over. A lot of this stuff still applies. But what's really good, and even though the videos are slightly on the older side, these videos actually go over quite a bit on how to light a room. If you really want to get into lighting, I think that's how you spell it. Jeremy Vickery, concept artist? No, not concept artist. Jeremy Vickery, lighting. There's this artist who works at Pixar, and his name is Jeremy Vickery. And he has a series of videos that also go over lighting for cinematics. His stuff is really good. On par with that is also these videos. So I would skim through maybe the first few videos and get a feel for what they're covering, but for the most part, try and take detailed notes tonight. Try and ask questions tonight. And then be able to stay a little longer if you can for the lab if you do have any more questions, just because lighting in general is not as technical, but it can be relatively dense. I'll just start off. I'll download this light scene first. I'm not too sure what this lava lamp is. You can download it and check it out and light it if you want to, but the assignment, it calls for one of these 2 scenes to be lit 2 different ways. Yeah.
So light each scene different ways, or light one scene 2 different ways?
Light the scene that you pick 2 different ways. So if you pick the room that I just downloaded, stick to that and light it 2 different ways with the same camera angle. And if you pick the Room 02 scene, keep the camera angle the same and then just light it 2 different ways. So what is light? Light's a lot of things. If I just type in light into Google, I probably get like tons of stuff. But the two kind of core aspects of light that you should always be thinking about is direct light and indirect light. So the sun emits light onto an object, and we consider that direct light. Now, if we didn't have indirect light, then all of our shadows, everything that light does not touch, would be black. But the fact is that materials have a tendency to bounce light or absorb light. So when the light in this room, the light is coming from the lights in the back of the room, and yet we can see the front of this room because light is either bouncing around the room or it's being absorbed. Stuff that is darker tends to absorb more light, and stuff that is lighter tends to bounce more light. So we can see in this room because of indirect lighting. In Maya, there are two forms of lighting. If I go to my render options, I have a choice to be able to select Maya software or not. Let me get the second one. Maybe there's just one.
Are you looking for a mental?
Arnold. This is Mental Ray to Arnold. That's not right. Huh, that's interesting. Maybe you'll just be messing around with one option because for some reason, I don't know if these Mayas have Arnold, but I guess it doesn't matter all too much because I'm going to be actually showing how to render in Maya software. So essentially in the whole entire world of 3D, there are two versions of lighting. There is, say, old school and new school. The old school is something like Maya software, where if you put a light in the scene, it directly lights an object and it colors that object depending on the color of the light. Whereas sort of the new school, where video games and movies are starting to push more toward, is actually physically accurate lighting. So you'll hear terms in video games called like PBR shaders. PBR stands for physically based rendering shaders. It's the idea that you can have a shader in a video game that works like how a real world shader would work. It has the idea of the conservation of energy. So if you have a very shiny object, the amount of energy hitting that object cannot equal more than 1. So there is a small bit of energy that is being absorbed to be able to see the color, but a good majority of the energy is being bounced off the reflective surface. So you can mimic those type of real-world effects in Maya software, but it's easier to do in a physically based program. Some other physically based renders. Arnold Render is one. Arnold gets used for a lot of movies nowadays. The gold standard for movies used to be Mental Ray. But Mental Ray was recently phased out of Maya, and now you have to download it as like a second-party application because Autodesk ended up buying Solid Angle, and Solid Angle makes Arnold. So now Arnold is supposedly packaged with Maya. I'm not too sure why it's not packaged with this Maya, but I have it on my home, and that's not Arnold, is it?
That's Arnold.
Oh, that's Arnold on that one? So I'm not too sure why it's not on this one. So if you have it on these computers, if you want to experiment with it, that's fine. But for this assignment, I'd like to see it in Maya software. Arnold, Mental Ray. Mental Ray is slightly older. It falls in between Maya software and Arnold in that It's old enough to have certain kind of straightforward standards like Maya software, but it does dabble a little bit in physically accurate, whereas a program like Arnold, a program like V-Ray are physically accurate renders. So the idea with it being physically accurate is that if I put a light in a scene, I automatically get bounce light, or I automatically get quadratic fall off to the light. I can set up my camera so that it is physically accurate. So, oh yeah. So to,
So you don't need a secondary light, is what you're saying?
yeah. So if I were to model this room and light this room, it is easier to light a room like this because I can put a single light in here and have the light bounce around. Maya software doesn't necessarily have that functionality, but it's good to understand what light does and be able to put in lights and very specifically put in that bounce light or put in that color. Have you guys messed at all with these render settings when you're doing your pair, or probably not? So if I go to the Common tab, I have two tabs up here. Usually there's a few more tabs, but because Maya software is old school, the amount of options have been condensed into two tabs. If I come down to image size, I can change the resolution of my image. For this, I'll change it to 640 by 480, something low. I'm not going to have my computer be sitting here for too long. Once I start to have more of a final, then I can switch it to either HD 720, which changes my aspect ratio, but also ups the amount of resolution that I have in the image to 1280 by 720, or the next one up, which is 1920 by 1080. Resolution should stay the same. Device aspect ratio should stay the same. For this exercise, I think the scene that you download has a second camera to it. So by default, the renderable camera is perspective. This is only used for batch rendering. So if you did do any type of batch rendering, you got to make sure that you set it here. Everything else is animation related. Everything else is batch rendering specific. So if I go to my Maya software tab, kind of the easiest thing you can do is go to quality and just change the settings up here. You'll notice that when I turn on these settings, it'll either turn off or turn on certain aspects of it. So if I switch it over to production quality, let's see if I can go in and explain things. Field options, render frames, motion blur. We won't have any motion blur, so you don't have to worry about that. Render options. I'm not going to be doing any fog. You can experiment with fog, but I tend to have kind of mixed results with fog, so I'll keep that closed. So the biggest thing is number of samples, multi-pixel filtering, and contrast threshold. What does all that mean? Well, the number of samples is how many times it'll sample on a given pixel. So what it's saying right here is that the minimum that it'll do is 2 samples. The max it'll do is 8. The more samples you have, the more precise the color of the pixel will be, but it'll take longer to render. Particles is something specific to particles in Maya. Multi-pixel filtering is just a fancy term for sharpening. So by default, it's on triangular filter. There's Gaussian filter. There's a few other filters. But what you can do is you can either play around with the 2 filters. So I'll leave it on triangle right now and show the renders a little bit later. But if I do a Gaussian filter, if I were to bring that image into Photoshop, and just do a regular filter sharpen, it would essentially bring me the same look as if I were to turn on triangular filter. Some people don't like this because it's modifying the final image outside of Maya or from Maya, whereas if you wanted that type of control, then you could leave it at Gaussian, bring it into Photoshop, and sharpen it to how you feel fit. So I'll leave it on Gaussian filter right now. Contrast threshold is extremely complicated. I don't know why it's divided up into red, green, blue, but if you look at the majority of the renders out there, essentially what it is contrast threshold is if you have two neighboring pixels next to each other, and let's say one is black and one is white, the contrast between the two is so extreme that it tells the render, hey, there's such a difference here, I may want to calculate the pixel next to it to double check that it's black. And it does black. And then it does the next pixel next to that. If it's not black, if it's say 80% black or 90% black, then it'll say, hey, the contrast ratio isn't as extreme. I can use the information that I gathered from that neighboring pixel and more or less judge what it's going to look like. So the contrast threshold can be adjusted so that you fine-tune the amount of sampling between when it starts to sample between the two different pixels. Ray tracing quality is specific to cast shadows. So I'll turn on ray tracing, and essentially what it is if you have a light in a scene and you turn on ray tracing on the light and also in the render, it essentially shoots rays from the light, and at any point that it doesn't hit, it'll create a cast shadow on the other side. So the amount of rays that it's shooting here is, if you have an item that is that it has a reflection to it, then at most it'll shoot 10 rays to be able to understand that reflection. If you have something that's refracting, like subsurface scattering or like skin, it'll shoot 10 rays into it to get the information. Shadows is cast shadow from the object. Bias isn't necessarily used. The only time that I've used bias, essentially what it is it looks at, so if you look at the corners of this room, the wall meets the ceiling, and if I have a light outside and it's shining on this building, essentially what you potentially might get is light leaking. So it knows that the cast shadow that is happening inside is being caused by the wall and the ceiling, but to prevent potential light leaking, you would adjust the bias so that the shadow starts sooner or starts later. The problem with having it on the overall is that it overall changes your cast shadow. I think there's bias options specific to the light that you can adjust. So it's best to leave that at 0. Okay, so I'm going to create a simple scene. As Maya yells at me every time. Tessellate up the geometry. I'll put the sphere just on the ground like this. I'm going to make my ground red. This window's huge. Okay. Woo! That's intense. Oh, it's not as intense for you guys. It's intense for me. There are, if I hold down the space bar, and if I go to create, and I go to lights, there are a series of lights that I can use for when I'm lighting. I'll just pull them all out and then I'll explain them. Create, directional, create, point light, create, spotlight, create, area light, create, volume light. Where is my outliner? There we go. Got a whole mess of lights. Okay. Let's see if we can get the screen a little bigger. Oh yeah? Bummer. Okay. So the first light we have is ambient light. If I go to my attribute editor, essentially what an ambient light is it's almost like a point light, but what an ambient light is that it can either emit light from a given point or it can emit light from just everywhere. If I change my ambient shade to 0, that essentially means that my whole scene is going to be just washed with one color and everything will be very flat. If I switch my ambient shade to 1, then it'll almost act as if light is emanating from that point. The directional light is essentially a sun. There's nothing like it. It's a continuous amount of rays from one point. And while the sun is itself essentially a point light, but the sun is so far away that the rays from the sun are very near parallel to each other. So it's easier to describe the sunlight as a directional light. The second light is a point light. It's essentially like a candle light or light emanating from one point. A point light cannot be an ambient light. Spotlight is a light emanating from a point but being projected through a cone. An area light is a, let's see, come in. An area light is a square light. It's mimicking I think it's called a softbox light in real life. So you have a film or something over the light and you have the light inside. So it diffuses the light to a point where there's no true indication of where the point light is coming from. So if I had a directional light, if I had a point light, you could clearly tell from the cast shadow where it's coming from, whereas the ambient light more or less creates a very broken up shadow. The size of the light, this is one of the only few lights this is the only light that the scale actually changes the shadow. So if I scale this down to something really small, then my shadows are going to be really crisp in coming from the geometry. If I scale my light really big, the cast shadow onto the sphere, from the sphere, will be really diffused and really broken up. And volumetric light, I don't really use, but essentially it's a light emanating from a point and stopping at a certain point. So if you have a street light out on the street, you could put this volume light up there to give the illusion that the light is emanating from a point but stopping at a certain edge. All lights have a color to them. All lights have an intensity to them. These options right here are checkboxes, and the checkbox specifically states that if you have it checked, it'll illuminate by default. So it means it illuminates the whole entire scene. If you have this checked, it emits diffuse. This one is emits specular. Diffuse is essentially the color that you see. Specular is specific to the shininess of the object. So if your material has a spec value, then having this check will actually show up on the material. If you wanted something, so if you have a bowling ball and it's very specular, it's very reflective, if you put in a lot of lights into it, and you need a lot of lights to, say, be able to light the bowling ball, but you don't necessarily want specular highlights all over it, you could potentially use one key light to emit the specular, and then for all the remaining lights, turn off emit specular to be able to light it, but not necessarily see all those hot spots on the reflection. I've been noticing that in the new Maya, they have ray trace shadows automatically turned on, which I guess it's something you just kind of have to get used to. By default, in all other Mayas, it used to be checked off. There are two ways to do shadows in Maya software. There's depth map shadows and there's ray trace shadows. Depth map shadows render substantially a lot faster than ray trace shadows, but because a lot of computers nowadays are pretty strong and they weren't what they used to be, I don't think anyone ever uses depth map shadows ever, period. But essentially what a depth map shadow is if I have the sphere and I put a light and I turn on depth map shadow, it'll create a cast shadow on the ground, but it's actually writing it to a texture. And it takes that texture and it probably does a multiply onto the ground right here. So if I were to have depth maps on, the resolution right here is literally a 512 by 512 texture to be able to create the shadow. Usually I have to crank that to at least a 1K or 2K to not see the stepping effect from the shadow. But like, I don't even know why it's even still in Maya, because no one uses it. So you don't have to know anything about that, other than it's old. It's really old. So ray trace is the way to go. So the vast majority of the lights have ray tracing. I guess all the lights have ray tracing. Nice. Let's see. So light angle. Light angle is how sharp or how diffuse the cast shadow is going to be. This is dependent on the scale of your scene. So if you're working really small, and if you put a light angle of, say, 0.5, it might disperse the shadow nicely. But if you work in real world scale, if you were to scale up your scene to, say, real world values, that 0.5 will be indistinguishable. You might have to crank it up to, say, 10. Shadow rays is how many rays are being shot from the light. The more rays you have, the more accurate of a shadow you'll see. And ray depth limit is the amount, how many times it'll go into an object that, say, has like subsurface scattering. So if I have an object, well, actually, if I have an object that is pure glass and the ray not only hits the surface, but it goes through the glass, it hits the back of the glass, it bounces forward, it hits the front of the glass, it's constantly bouncing around. If you have 3, that means that inside the glass it's bouncing around 3 times and it stops. The reason we have a ray depth limit is because if you didn't have a depth limit, the computer would render for eternity. Like literally eternity. So you have to say, whoa, 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 when you hit 3, stop. You don't have to render anymore. You can also notice this if you have 2 mirrors that are in front of each other. If you have a light, you'll see it bounce 3 times. If you crank it up to 10, you'll see it bounce 10 times. whereas a normal mirror in the real world is just infinite. But if you were to tell a computer to do it infinitely, it would just sit there and render forever. So you have to impose a limit. Settings. I'm setting up my camera here. In the first room scene, the camera's already set up for you. In the second room scene, you'll have to adjust it yourself. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that gorgeous?
No cash shadow.
No cast shadow. Why is there no cast shadow? Because
Use ray.
I don't have ray trace on.
So now you adjust the ray trace.
So I'll go.
You're missing the reflective light below it.
Yeah. So in a render, so essentially you put a light in, it's direct light. In Maya software, there is no indirect light calculations. The indirect lighting comes from you putting more lights in.
Oh, okay, that's what you're talking about. You use another. Okay.
Yeah. So this is essentially a world with no indirect light.
But if you had Arnold in this, would it do that?
It would, but that's a whole nother lecture. So
Gotcha.
it's a whole can of worms. But essentially, what you get is you would actually see this the shadow lit up,
Yeah.
and you'd see red bouncing off from the ground onto the sphere. Okay. So this is ambient shade at 1. This is ambient shade at 0. You'll see that my ray trace shadows are still on. So if I turn that off and render again, I'll get a very flat color. So it's kind of nice to say if you're modeling something and you more or less like something from Dota, something from Heroes of the Storm, a game where it's more reliant on the texture quality and you're painting in those darks in that form. You could have the model in here. You could place an ambient light in the scene, take the ambient shade down to 0, and then be able to just view the model with straight texture instead of it actually being lit. Again, for reference. So these are the two differences between the ambient shade and I believe it comes in at 0.5. So it's actually the melding between something that has a little bit of shaded quality and something that has flat quality. Yeah. Oh, you're stretching. So this is a good kind of light if you want light all around. Directional lights can be scaled, but they don't affect the light. The only reason you'd scale a directional light is to be able to grab it and see it. So you can see because my point light or my ambient light was so close to my object, my cast shadow is very elongated. Whereas a directional light, now that my light rays are parallel, my shadow is a lot smaller and a lot more close to what the actual sphere looks like.
So how do you get more? Shadows are rarely that crisp.
Yeah.
Often they sort of diffuse.
So if I take my light and I'll leave all these numerical values the same, if I go to light angle and we'll put a 1 and we'll save the image and render it out.
Starting to feel like diffusion.
A little bit. I'll do a extreme. So you'll notice that it's starting to get speckly, or you'll start to see some dots when it should be smooth. So if I put in this light and I like the render quality of, say, the color and the way, I mean, this is kind of having issues. We'll have to address that. But if I crank up my shadow rays, now you don't want to put crazy numbers because there's a certain threshold. If I were to put, say, 5 and render it out, now let me save it. Put 10, render it out. Should be getting a little better. But 10 shouldn't be that high. So the biggest problem with rendering is that you kind of have two buckets. You have samples coming from the light, and you have samples that are controlled by the actual render options. So if I cranked up this to... Oh, I'm stupid. Scratch that. Just kidding. I'm doing the wrong one. How come no one told me? So that's 5. So these two are the same. Shadow rays to 10, not light angle. So you can see my render time is now a lot longer. And it's subtle, but it's not as spotty. So you can either adjust the amount of shadow rays here. I don't know if I'd want to go up higher than 10. The other option...
Is this what you were talking about, where you can get the Gaussian blur on a reflected, like, you can actually, can you create that with, if you like export to Photoshop or something, or is it doesn't vary then?
One more time?
Never mind,
Okay.
I have a feeling I answered my question.
So the so see this stepping, or see how it's like slightly blurry. If I save my image and if I go to my render options and I switch it to triangle filter and I close and I render, that'll take a second.
Actually, that's what I was talking about. If you change it to Gaussian blur,
Yeah.
it's kind of the same thing.
So that's Gaussian and that's triangle filter. So it's just how it so in this case the Gaussian is slightly, or the triangle filter is slightly blurry, and the Gaussian is slightly crisper. It helps to have a little bit of blur in your image, because if you get too crisp, then you'll have to put in really high values to be able to smooth it back out. Whereas here you can kind of fudge it a little bit. So if this is on the triangle filter and this is Gaussian, if you leave it on triangle, you can kind of get away with not having nearly as many rays. It makes it's very, very subtle. It makes the image just slightly blurry, but it's better than waiting hours on end for your computer to render. Let's see. Oh, so back to render options. So I have shadow rays right here that I can adjust, that I can get better shadows, or I can go to my shading and say adjust this to, say, 4 and 10. Let's try that. This might take a while, so let's give it a second. And I'll bring it back down so we're not sitting here for too long. So it's really subtle. It's very subtle. But essentially what you're telling the render is that the lowest amount of sampling that that I want to do is 4. The max that I want to do is 10. But I'll leave it for 2 and 8 for right now, just so we're not waiting here for too long. Point light is similar to the ambient light. With the ambient light, the point light, the spotlight, and I think the area light has it on by default. But basically, all those lights don't have decay rate on, and decay rate is essentially
Where is the pen's dying.
So quadratic decay rate doesn't necessarily mean like light is near infinite. Like the amount of light that comes out of the sun versus what we get on Earth is essentially the same. But the decay rate is that the amount of light that is coming through, say, this square is now taking up this much. The amount of rays are starting to decay or start to pull apart. Quadratic just means that if your light is right here, it starts to decay in quadratic intervals, whereas the other two will decay probably a lot more shallow. Lights in the real world have quadratic decay. So for this point light, instead of linear, instead of cubic, I'll switch it to quadratic. This is the default light, and I'll render it again. Now my light is falling off exponentially. I'll increase my intensity, and you can start to see, I start to see the image now. So instead of a light that is infinitely going on forever, I now have, say, something that is more accustomed to, say, a candle light, where if I have a candle light in the middle of the room, the walls are going to be nowhere near as bright as if I were to put my hand up against close to the light. Spotlight. Let's see. Object. Spotlight is exactly what it says. A light coming from a spot. It too has a decay rate. It also has other options. Cone angle. You can see it change right there. So if I want like almost like a laser beam, I can bring that down to a very small value. If I want a very wide angle, I can increase that. The penumbrum angle will blur the edge of the spot. So that's default, and that's penumbra angle at 10. You can conversely do it, and it'll go into the light shape. and drop off is the amount it starts to drop off before it starts to reach the penumbrum angle. I'll change that to 0 just so we can see. A lot of these have shadow colors. I would experiment with shadow colors, but they tend to change your scene in maybe unpredictable ways. And really, you should put in a light to be able to change the color of the shadow. But if I were to change this color to, say, like a really intense blue, then the blue then gets multiplied on top of the red ground and starts to lighten up my shadow. But the problem with adjusting this color is that it only does the cast shadow. It doesn't necessarily adjust the other side of the sphere, which if you were to put in a light, it could do both at the same time. Let's see. It's kind of the basics on that light. There's also these barn doors, which are more realistic, but don't really use them. So these are the barn doors on an actual light. It allows you to, instead of having a light just emit all over, you can put down a barn door to prevent the light from going too high, going too far to the sides, or going too low. Area light is probably one of the better lights, and probably one of the lights, like I use area light probably like 80% of the time, just because it creates really nice shadows. I mean, there isn't enough resolution here, but it creates nice fall off and it creates nice shadows. Oh, let's see. So if I scale my light, you'll see that the intensity rises and the amount of diffusion of the cast shadow happens. Whereas if I scale my light really small, then it'll be a lot darker, but I can come in here, increase my intensity on the light, and render it out. So it's very close to how, say, a physical light would react. If the light is bigger, of course, it's going to emit more light. So you can see my cast shadow is pretty broken up, whereas my cast shadow here is getting to the point where it's almost like a point light or a spotlight. But I did have to adjust my intensity. And volume light, I never use, so don't use it. Obviously, it doesn't work right out of the box. I never use a volume light for anything. If you want to figure out how it works, be my guest. So, let's see. So I'll do it in Photoshop, because then the video will capture it. A lot of stuff, a lot of ads you see, a lot of videos you see are contrived, go figure, that, you know, if it's a person standing outside, there's a good chance that there's a bounce card there, there's a good chance that there's an additional light there, there's a rim light there, there's some type of light there that is modifying the final shot. So just because it looks natural doesn't necessarily mean they're not using any lights. So lighting is extremely powerful. I create a new one. There are all different types of lighting methods. So instead of having one light and just bounce it around, there's actually a lot of lights. You have like your key light, you have your fill lights. Some of these might be creating a rim light. All these essentially are area lights. This is like an area light in Maya. Here's an area light. Here's a spotlight with barn doors. So there's a lot of similarities between what we use in the real world and what is being used in Maya. Actually, you know what? Why am I drawing it? I'm funny. Jeez Louise. Why don't I just show it here instead of drawing it? So I'll bring in a directional light. I'll scale it up. Put some color to it. Not too much. And I'll render it out. One of the greatest things you can do is put color to your light. When you don't put color to your light, it can make your renders feel stale. There are lights in this world that are really, really, really close to white, but for the majority of the lights in this world, they are either cool or they're warm, or they've been augmented to be a different color. But if you go to Home Depot, if you go to Lowe's, you'll notice that lights are either cool or they're warm. So, the other very important thing that everyone needs to know is I put a light in my scene. Let's say I wanted to have cast shadow, but technically the light is underneath a piece of geometry, but I want it to shine on my sphere. So if I go to the drop down up in the upper left hand corner and I go to rendering and I go to lighting and shading, there's this option here called Light Linking Editor. There's light centric and object centric. They're exactly the same. The only difference is that light sources, when you say light centric, light sources is on the left, illuminated objects is on the right, object centric, object is on the left, lighting is on the right. That is the only difference. If I click on my directional light that I want it to be able to fill this cast shadow, I have it named as directional light 2. If I click on directional light number 2, I don't want it to illuminate my plane, but I do want it to illuminate my sphere. So now that I've selected the plane off, if I hit a render, then it won't light up the plane, but it'll only light up the sphere. I want to do the same thing for my directional light 3. If I turn off the plane and only the sphere, then the plane won't get in the way. I'm going to change my intensity to something larger. Okay. So there are all different kind of forms of light. The biggest terms that can be used for light is if I have a light that is directly shining on an object, like my yellow light right here, this is what's considered a key light. If I have a light that is illuminating my the dark on the sphere, that's my fill light. If I have a light that is on the side, but only traverses the object maybe about, say, like a centimeter on the screen or like an inch on the screen. That's called a kicker. And if I have a light that is almost directly behind the object, that's called a rim light. So I'll write these up on the board really quick. A lot of people use the term rim light when really they mean kicker. It helps to be able to use those two definitions to be able to distinguish how far you want the light behind the object to go. Oh, this pen sucks. Is there a better pen? No? Nope. Bummer. Can anyone see that?
Why don't you type it in Word or something?
I do that.
So then it'll be.
That'll be on the video. Like the way you think. Let's see. I do it here. Let me paint my sphere really quick. Like my awesome painting skills. Oh man, this is ridiculous. Yeah, you get it. You get it, right? It kind of works. Hold on, I gotta load all my fonts. Come on. Oh, I gotta load the color. Giant. What is this? Give me recognizable Arial. I capitalized key, but I swear I didn't mean to. So we have key lights. We have fill lights. We have kicker, and we have rim. Key light. What'd I do? Call that the fill light, kicker, rim. So you use the key light to illuminate an object. You use a fill light to illuminate the portion that is not being illuminated by the key light, so really the dark area. The kicker light and the rim light are used to pull the object from the background. So if the background is really dark, but you want to still be able to show form, then you'd use those two lights to be able to almost outline the form. Hey, where'd my Maya go? There we go. Any questions? It's a lot. No questions? Let's see.
So were you saying for the homework, you want us to use two different kinds of lights to light the scene?
So I'll light the room scene right now. I'll show you guys how I'll do it, or how I would do it. Is this it? Let's see. Documents. Projects. Lips to form. Put it in there. So when you first open it up, let's see, I'm gonna do. When you first open it up, there's going to be, it's going to be instantly putting you into camera 1. So you can either go to a second window and go to your normal perspective camera and leave camera 1 alone, or yeah, you should do that. So I'll leave camera 1 right here, but I'll change my perspective, or my panel's perspective to perspective, and I'll use this to edit my lights and rearrange my lights. In the scene, there's 2 lights that you can use for the night render. There's a window that you can use for the night render or the day render. So there are a few areas where you can put lighting. I'll start off with my directional light. I'll scale it up so I can see it. I'll go to my render options and make sure my render options are correct. 640 by 480. My software, it's set to low. The lower the setting, the quicker it'll render, but it'll look not so good. So because these computers are relatively fast and because my software isn't necessarily demanding, I'll switch over to production quality from the get-go. I'll also make sure that my ray tracing quality is turned on. I will go to render, camera 1. So I'm specifying what camera to render from. My scene is very dark, but the best way to get started with lighting is to start with your source and follow the light around the room. So I'm going to change my intensity. I'll change my color to more of a yellow color. And render it out. I think I want the light to say hit a little bit of the sofa here. I want to hit the ground right here. So right now I have my direct light, and the next process is going to be creating all my indirect light to start filling out the room. So I'll start off by creating a area light. I'll rotate my area light 180. I'll scale it to the size of the window. Roughly. So I'm imagining that this light that I have right here is a combination of the light being broken up by the window frame. It's a combination of the sky outside coming through. So I'll select my light, change it to blue, hit render. I'll adjust my intensity. And I'll probably get a lot of artifacts in my shadows. It's not something that I want to deal with right now. Just because if I sit there trying to make one shadow look good, it doesn't mean that if I introduce a second light, it might knock out the shadow completely. So it might not be worth putting in those extra calculations for the shadow. I'll duplicate my area light again. No. Let's see. So I thought I could. I'll place it roughly on the ground. Now this one I don't need any cast shadow. So I'll go to my light, I'll go to my shadow, I'll turn it off. And I want to place it roughly where the light is streaming through. I know I don't want it to be that intense, so I'll bring it to, say, 0.2. Definitely don't want it that intense. I'll pull it up a little bit. I'll lower this down more. Instead of blue, I'll make it yellow. I'll increase the yellow that I have. The problem with this scene is that the floor is blue. If you have a scene that is like hardwood floor, it tends to make light look a little better. But the floor is blue, the chairs are blue, and the wall is gray. So getting some warmth in this room can be a little tricky. I don't want my light to be under the table, so I'll pull it out to the side. So now that I have this area light right there, it's starting to create a nice kind of bloom on the ground. Make it a little bit bigger. Now light is being shot through the window, hitting my floor. A combination of it is being absorbed in the floor. The rest of it is being scattered into the room. Because I'd imagine that this is carpet, I probably just want to duplicate my area light. Change it to a blue. Sure. Probably not that intense blue. Probably knock it down a little bit. I'll mess with having ray trace shadows on. See what I get. I'll up the intensity on the light, but not too high. I don't want to instantly flood the area with light because I'm going to be adding a lot of light into it. So now I have the illusion of the light bouncing off the ground and hitting the walls. But I think the color of my light is maybe a little too green. So I'll adjust the color and bring it more toward blue.
Why are you leaving that floodlight? What did you call that light, the big one that you have?
This one?
Yeah.
Why am I leaving it there?
So why would you, I mean, there's already one on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
It's reflecting the light that comes in,
Mm-hmm.
bouncing back up. Wouldn't you put it on the ceiling and have it just a little more diffuse or a little, less intensity? Why leave it down there?
So if I follow the light,
Yeah.
if I see the light, if I see my light beam come through here, it is hitting this floor and it should be emanating from the floor because it's hitting the floor and then it's shooting off the floor.
This is the first one. Okay, I thought there was another one on top.
Oh, there is another one.
So why wouldn't that be on the ceiling? The second, comes in, hits the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's going this way.
Mhm.
So there's the second one that you added, which you put on the ceiling and have it
So the first one
is down.
is pointing downward.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
And the reason it's pointing down is because probably the best way to put it is if I have a light going through the window, there's a certain amount of dispersion that is coming from the window. It hits the windowsill, it breaks up a little bit. I could come in here and I could adjust my shadow so it's not as crisp, but the core of the shadow is going to be very dark. So if I put a light right there, it'll give the illusion that not only do you have direct light coming through the window, but you have a lot of kind of diffused light that is following with it, that it sort of illuminates this section right here.
So the first one that you have is a little bit above the ground.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's slightly above the ground, yeah. And then I duped it, and then flipped it, and then up the intensity, yeah. So I have a lot of, so I'm starting to build up my lighting here. I could bring in another area light. And we could say like, well, maybe this is the light that is coming from the hallway, or it's coming from a TV, or it's exactly what I was showing you guys where everything is contrived. So just because I'm trying to mimic the real world doesn't mean I shouldn't put lights in here that aren't necessarily 100% real world. So this room is it's so blue, it's tricky.
Could we change the color of the wallpaper?
Yeah, you can change any of the materials in the scene. But I think what I'll do is the majority of the lights coming into the scene, I'll start to warm up a bit more. I also have that other light in there. And I can either, because some of the best lighting scenarios kind of have like a warm and cool. If you have a warm key light, then you might want to have a kicker or fill light that's cool. But since the majority of my scene is cool, I think I'm going to try my fill light to be warm. I'll up the intensity more on my key. Let's try 8. It'll make this a little more intense. 10. My outside is black, so that's not very fun. So I can either put a card out there or a piece of geometry out there with a light connected to it and only have that light emit to that piece of geometry, or I could go to my camera 1. I can select my camera with this button. I can scroll down to environment, and I can change the color of the environment. So now it's made my window kind of bright, or really bright. I'll put in an ambient light in the scene. Don't want my ambient light to cast shadows, so I want to have that off. And this will just help fill in some of the more darker shadows. Might be too intense, so I'll have to adjust it. Very intense. So I'll make my ambient light cool. Try 0.5. Still probably a little intense, but we're on the right track. A little less, just a little. Not too bad. So I'm having, so let's say this is my final lighting. I could go in and I could add more lights. I could put lights behind the couch as if light is bouncing behind the couch. But if I were to call this done, then I would go in, and the first thing I would do is if I go to my render options, I might adjust my shading from 4 to 10. So that'll make my render times longer, but overall it'll make things look a little better. The quality of the render on the geometry, let's say, is something that I like I'm getting the nice crisp lines, I'm getting the nice shading effect. So really it's the amount of resolution that I have in my shadows. So I'll select my key light and I'll go to shadow rays. I'll put a little bit of light angle. I think 1 might be too much. Let's see. Yeah, 1's too much. I'll adjust it to 0.2. So light angle breaks up my lighting ever so slightly. The amount of rays for this light is only going to affect this light right here. To remember that all the indirect lighting I've done will not be affected by this number. I'll click on my next light and go to my shadow rays, and I'll try 10 and see how that goes. I only do a section. Might be this light. So you see 10 is adjusting this one. Now it's getting to the point where if I look at this, I can clearly see the spotted effect, whereas this one I don't see the spotted effect, but I'm going to bring this down to 8 because if I were to put a number in there, say 200, Maya will do its best to render that many samples, but the human eye, or the amount of pixels that you have on the screen, it may be indistinguishable between 10 and 200. It might be indistinguishable between 8 and 200. So you got to make sure that you're not putting crazy numbers, or else your render times are going to be severe and you're not even going to be able to see a difference. So 10 was actually too high. So I'm bringing it down to 3, and I'm starting to see a little bit of stepping. So I think 4 is a good number. So 4 is offering me the best results. So using that information, I'll come to this light and I'll change it to 4. And I'll go to this light and I'll change it to 4. And that's starting to produce pretty good results. At the expense of render time. The reason I don't do too much, say, light fog is because light fog is great if you're doing a video and you want the illusion of light transferring through fog, but to be able to get the effect to work kind of correctly and exactly how you want, it makes more sense to just do it in Photoshop. So if I wanted like a stream of light to come through this window, I could take it into Photoshop and just marquee out this section and then lighten it up a little bit and then blur out the shape. The other thing that I didn't mention, which I don't use at all, but it's still a good thing to know, is that if I create a light, and let's say I create a point light, and I'll put the point light right here, and I'll put it right here. So this is what my scene looks like right now. And I'll save out my image. Light in the computer can actually take negative values. So if I say -1, it actually turns into essentially like a black hole. So it'll suck light from that point. Oh yeah, my render times are high. But you should be able to tell. Oh, and also ray trace shadows are on this point light, so it's going to be even more crazy. And there's also no decay on the light, so it's going to be even more crazy. So I'll stop it so we don't wait forever. So you can see that the cast shadow from the light is right here, and anything the light touches, it takes away light. It's a good little tool if, say, like let's say I look at, let's say I go to my shadows, I turn off ray tracing, I put my light, say, behind here, and I use it kind of artistically. Say I put it like right, I don't want that close. Say I put it right here. I'll adjust my negative value to, say, -0.2. Might be too much. I guess that's good. So I can very intentionally put that light behind things to be able to maybe push the light of the object forward. So in looking at the original render, I may be getting light from my area light or from another light that is going behind the couch, which I may not necessarily want. So I can put a point light in the back there to be able to take light away. But I would use it very carefully because it can be very intense. Also, you know what would help? If I turn on quadratic decay. Even then I might have to adjust it, but so me kind of upsampling, me adjusting the amount of rays that are coming to the light should be one of the last things that you do. A lot of the iterative process that you do now is best when those numbers are low, so you're not sitting here for very long. So I put the light behind here. It's now taking light away from the wall, it's taking light away from the vicinity, and it helps push forward this tabletop. I could do the same thing to this corner. I could do the same thing up in this corner. Yeah, it's something that you more or less use artistically. It doesn't necessarily happen in the real world. It looks a little dark there. If you get it, say 95, 99% of the way in Maya, it's perfectly fine to be able to bring it into Photoshop and do those last corrections. Maya can bring you pretty close. Maya software can bring you, pretty close. But sometimes it helps to bring it that extra mile in Photoshop. And kind of leave that up to you. Are there any questions? No. So that's everything I got. That's kind of lighting in a nutshell. My software is old. It's good to understand the basics. It's good to understand what the lights do, so that in the future, if you do more 3D, if you do more lighting, it gets you prepared for more physically accurate renders. For games, it would be something like maybe Marmoset. For film, again, it's something like Arnold and V-Ray. So, thanks, guys. That's what I got. You guys are welcome to stay here, work on the room, ask me any questions. I'll be here till 9:30.